USS Blue Ridge was not where she was supposed to be. The 7th Fleet Flagship, hull number LCC-19, 634 feet of command and control architecture, home port Yokosuka, Japan, sailed into Manila Bay on a Tuesday in early July 2026 and dropped anchor 8 nautical miles from the shoreline. She carried a 3-star vice admiral. She carried the full communications suite of a floating joint operations center. She carried the flag of the United States 7th Fleet. And her flight deck was 1,140 miles from the contested shoal. A carrier strike group holding open ocean, well outside the zone where Beijing had positioned its forces to control the confrontation. That is the move. A command ship, not a destroyer, not a carrier, not a submarine, inside Philippine sovereign water at the precise moment the Philippine Navy was running its most contested resupply mission of the year to BRP Sierra Madre, a deliberately grounded hulk on Second Thomas Shoal, 200 miles to the southwest. Blue Ridge stayed 8 days. Her flag never came down. The question is not why the United States Navy sent a ship to Manila. The question is why it sent this ship to this water at this exact moment, and what the decision to use a command vessel rather than a combatant tells you about the strategic logic that has been building in the South China Sea since 2022. Because the answer is not what the official statement said. The port visit was logged as a routine engagement, a scheduled stop, a relationship-building call. But command ships do not move on routine schedules. Flagship movements are deliberate. A 3-star flag flying in Manila Bay for 8 days while a resupply run was under pressure from the People's Liberation Army Navy is not a coincidence of scheduling. It is a signal architecture, and the audience for that signal was not in Manila. To read it correctly, you need to understand what Blue Ridge actually is, what Second Thomas Shoal actually decides, and why the Pentagon spent the last 6 months converting a floating headquarters into a maneuver piece on the South China seaboard. Start with the geography. Second Thomas Shoal sits inside the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. Under UNCLOS, the waters are Philippine. Under a 2016 arbitral ruling that China does not recognize, the shoal itself is Philippine. The Chinese position is that the shoal is part of the Spratly Islands, which China claims in full, and that the Philippine Navy's presence on BRP Sierra Madre, the rusting World War II-era ship deliberately run aground in 1999 to establish a physical claim, is an illegal occupation that must end. The Philippines has maintained a rotating garrison of Marines on the Sierra Madre for 27 years. The mission of those Marines is to exist. Their presence is the claim. The supply runs that keep them alive are therefore not logistics operations. They are sovereignty assertions. Every water cannon, every laser dazzle, every blocking maneuver the planned Coast Guard deploys against a Philippine resupply vessel is an attempt to make the assertion untenable. The geometry of the problem is specific. Second Thomas Shoal is 105 nautical miles west of Palawan. It is 250 nautical miles from the nearest major Philippine naval base at Puerto Princesa. The resupply vessels, typically small Coast Guard cutters or contracted civilian vessels, cross open water, with no air cover, with no escort that can legally engage a Chinese vessel, and with planned Coast Guard ships waiting at the shoal perimeter on almost every run. The July 2026 resupply was different in one measurable way from the December 2024 run, which produced the most documented water cannon incident on record, and from the March 2026 run, which ended with a Philippine Coast Guard rigid inflatable being disabled. The July 2026 run was different because USS Blue Ridge was in Manila Bay when it happened. Now watch what a ship's wake at sea actually means when it appears on that radar scope at this range, because proximity on the display translates directly into response time, and response time is the only currency that matters when a freedom of navigation patrol crosses into contested water. Blue Ridge is not a combatant ship. She carries no offensive weapons system that would make her a warfighting platform in the conventional sense. What she carries is the 7th Fleet Commander, his staff, and the command and control infrastructure that allows the United States to coordinate naval operations across the entire Indo-Pacific theater from a single hull. She is, in the language of naval architecture, a command ship. In the language of strategic signaling, she is the most valuable non-combatant vessel in the Pacific Fleet. That distinction matters enormously. If the United States had sent an Arleigh Burke destroyer or a Los Angeles-class attack submarine into Philippine waters during the resupply run, the signal would have been clear in the military dimension but contested in the political one. Beijing would have characterized it as a provocation, as a militarization of a territorial dispute, as evidence that Washington was acting as a belligerent. The talking points were already prepared. They have been prepared since 2016. But a command ship is different. Blue Ridge's presence does not change the rules of engagement of any Philippine vessel. She does not escort the resupply mission. She does not interpose between the planned Coast Guard and the Philippine cutters. What she does is place the 7th Fleet Commander, a Vice Admiral of the United States Navy, in the same geographic theater as the operation, with full situational awareness, in direct communication with both the Philippine military and with Pacific Fleet headquarters in Pearl Harbor. If something happens to a Philippine vessel while the 7th Fleet Commander is sitting 200 miles away in Manila Bay with his flag flying, it is not a bilateral Philippines-China incident. It is an incident that happened while the United States military's senior Pacific naval officer was watching. That changes the threshold calculation for every decision Beijing makes at Second Thomas Shoal. Think of it in terms of audience. The planned Coast Guard officers on those vessels understand the chain of command. They understand that when USS Blue Ridge is in Manila Bay, every action at Second Thomas Shoal is being watched by the officer responsible for the entire Western Pacific naval architecture. The decision to use a water cannon, to block a vessel, to seize a supply container is no longer a decision made in a theater where the United States is a distant observer. It is a decision made in a theater where the United States is present, informed, and formally engaged with the Philippine Armed Forces through the Mutual Defense Treaty. One detail that stuck with me in reviewing the timeline of this deployment: the AFP Western Command, which has operational responsibility for the Palawan region and Second Thomas Shoal, issued a coordination statement on the 4th day of Blue Ridge's visit. Not a press release. A coordination statement. The language in military communications is precise. Coordination means the command structures are aligned, talking, and operating with shared situational awareness. That document is the paper trail that converts a port visit into a joint operation in everything but name. Every mission on this channel gets broken down past the press release, the ship, the flight path, the decision behind the order. Hit subscribe and stay in the fight. Now to the Mutual Defense Treaty, because Blue Ridge's presence in Manila Bay is meaningless without understanding what that treaty actually commits and what it deliberately leaves ambiguous. The 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and the Philippines commits both parties to act to meet a common danger if either is attacked in the Pacific. The critical ambiguity is in the definition of attack. For the first 6 decades of the treaty's existence, the South China Sea question was largely theoretical. The islands and shoals were contested on maps and in diplomatic cables, not at the hull-to-hull level. That changed in 2012 when China seized Scarborough Shoal. It changed further in 2013 when the Philippines initiated arbitral proceedings. It changed again in 2016 when the tribunal ruled in Manila's favor and China declared the ruling null and void. And it changed in a measurable operational sense between 2021 and 2024 when the planned Coast Guard began deploying water cannons, lasers, and physical blocking maneuvers against Philippine resupply vessels with increasing frequency and increasing intensity. The treaty has never been tested at the level of direct armed attack. But the line between coercive pressure and armed attack is now being drawn in real time, in the water between Palawan and Second Thomas Shoal, one resupply run at a time. Washington has been explicit since 2023 that an armed attack on Philippine armed forces, vessels, or aircraft in the South China Sea would trigger the treaty. The State Department statements are on record. The ambiguity that remains is not in the commitment. It is in the threshold. What counts as armed attack? A water cannon is water. A blocking maneuver is navigation. A disabled, rigid inflatable could be characterized as a navigation accident. Beijing has been extraordinarily careful to stay inside the space where the characterization is contestable. Every action at Second Thomas Shoal has been calibrated to be just coercive enough to degrade Philippine resupply capability and just restrained enough to avoid triggering a treaty response. Blue Ridge's presence compresses that calibration space. Most people assume that treaty deterrence operates at the strategic level, through carrier groups and alliance commitments in diplomatic communiques. But the evidence tells a different story in this particular theater. The deterrence that matters at Second Thomas Shoal is not the carrier. It is the flag. A three-star flag in Manila Bay places an American officer with command authority inside the decision loop. The question Beijing has to answer before every resupply run is not whether an armed attack would trigger the treaty. They know it would. The question is whether any specific action can be characterized as not an armed attack. Blue Ridge's presence narrows the space in which that question can be answered ambiguously. The resupply run proceeded. There were planned Coast Guard vessels at the shoal perimeter. There was the standard suite of blocking and harassment activity. But the July 2026 run completed its mission. The Marines on BRP Sierra Madre received supplies. Every arrested landing logged, every MH-60 Seahawk lifted off that deck on schedule. That operational tempo is not coincidence. It is data. Now pull back from this single patrol and watch the carrier deck operations, the freedom of navigation transits, the submarine hunt sorties, the pattern that has been building across the Pacific since January 2025. The Indo-Pacific posture shift that began in 2021 and accelerated through the Taiwan Strait tensions of 2022 and 2023 had a specific geographic logic. Concentrate firepower and deterrence infrastructure inside the first island chain, where U.S. forces can operate on interior lines, and force China to project power through choke points it does not control. The Guam buildup, the EDCA site expansion in the Philippines, the AUKUS submarine basing arrangement in Darwin, these are all expressions of the same geometric logic. Push the contested space as far inside the envelope as possible. The EDCA sites, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement that allows U.S. forces to access and use Philippine military installations, are the mechanism. There are now 9 agreed EDCA sites. 4 of them are on Luzon. 3 are on the Visayas. 2 are on Palawan, the island chain whose southern tip is closest to the operational area at Second Thomas Shoal and Scarborough Shoal. The Palawan sites are the ones that matter for this analysis. They put U.S. prepositioned equipment, logistics infrastructure, and potentially rotational forces within 250 nautical miles of Second Thomas Shoal. For reference, that is inside the operating radius of an F/A-18, inside the patrol range of a P-8 Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft, and inside the communication relay range of a ship-based helicopter. The EDCA sites are not offensive infrastructure. They are the logistics skeleton that would make any response to a South China Sea incident faster and more capable than anything the United States could generate from Guam, which sits 1,700 miles to the northeast. Guam is the second island chain anchor. It is where the B-52S rotate, where the attack submarines operate from, where the logistics and fuel infrastructure for a sustained Pacific operation lives. But Guam is too far from Second Thomas Shoal to be operationally relevant in the timescale of a Coast Guard confrontation. The relevant geography is the Philippines. The relevant platform is whatever is already inside the theater when the incident happens. Blue Ridge sits at anchor in Manila Bay, her island superstructure visible from the pier. Inside the theater, engines warm, command circuits open. Now the reframe that the map makes obvious once the numbers are on the table. A command ship in Manila Bay is not a warfighting asset. But in the logic of the South China Sea contest, the warfighting assets are not the point. The point is the decision architecture. Who is watching, who has authority, who can communicate to the Philippine military in real time, and who can relay the situation to Pacific Fleet and INDOPACOM before the incident is characterized by CGTN and Global Times in terms favorable to Beijing. Blue Ridge is the decision architecture made physical. Her presence in Manila Bay during the resupply run means that the 7th Fleet Commander has direct situational awareness, direct communication with AFP Western Command, and direct authority to recommend escalation to higher command if the situation crosses a threshold. That chain exists in peacetime through phone calls and satellite links. Blue Ridge makes it exist through physical presence. The difference is not technical. It is political. When a 3-star admiral is in the room, decisions get made faster. When that admiral's flag is flying in the same body of water as the contested operation, the political cost of a Chinese action that produces a visible incident rises in a nonlinear way. We should be precise about what this is. This is not an assertion that Blue Ridge's presence prevented a specific Chinese action. The evidence does not support that level of causal specificity. What the evidence supports is that the July 2026 resupply run was completed without the level of physical interference that characterized the March 2026 run, and that it was completed during a period when the 7th Fleet Commander was physically present in Manila Bay. The inference is calibrated, not invented. Here's the take that may get some pushback. The Pentagon has been too cautious in using Blue Ridge as a signaling instrument. The ship has spent most of its operational existence in Yokosuka, available as a command node but not as a presence signal. A flagship anchored at its home port is a capability. A flagship deployed into contested adjacent waters is a message. The July 2026 Manila deployment suggests the calculus changed. But one deployment is not a posture. If Blue Ridge returns to Yokosuka and stays there while the next resupply run faces the same suite of planned Coast Guard harassment, then July 2026 was an anomaly, not a strategy. The signal requires repetition to become doctrine. The question for the back half of 2026 is whether the Pentagon has made a deliberate decision to use Blue Ridge as a recurring presence signal, or whether the July deployment was situational, a response to a specific intelligence picture about planned Coast Guard intentions for the July run that made the flagship's presence operationally justified. What do you think? Is one flagship deployment enough to shift Beijing's calculus at Second Thomas Shoal, or does the deterrent effect require a consistent pattern of presence? Leave your read in the comments. The radar scope is not showing a single contact. It is showing a pattern. And that pattern is the question every commander in this theater is trying to answer right now. Now to the rival's position, because the board only reads correctly when you understand what China has built and what the Blue Ridge deployment costs them. The plan's South China Sea posture is built around a layered access denial architecture. The primary layer is the artificial islands, Fiery Cross Reef, Subi Reef, Mischief Reef in the Spratly chain, each of which now hosts a military installation with airstrip, hangar capacity, radar, and weapons systems. From these islands, the plan can project air and naval power across the entire Spratly group. The secondary layer is the Coast Guard, the world's largest by vessel count, deployed in a standing presence around contested features including Scarborough Shoal and the waters around Second Thomas Shoal. The planned Coast Guard vessels at Second Thomas Shoal are large. The China Coast Guard 5901, the largest Coast Guard vessel in the world at 165 meters, has been present in the area. These are not small patrol boats. They are quasi-military vessels with water cannons, electronic surveillance suites, and the authority to intercept, block, and seize. Against this architecture, the Philippine Navy has no naval combatant capable of escorting a resupply vessel through a water cannon engagement without risking a bilateral military incident that Manila is not positioned to win at the tactical level. The asymmetry in hull size and armament is not close. The Philippines is not attempting to win a naval engagement. It is attempting to complete a resupply run. Those are different problems, and the solution to the second problem is not a destroyer. The solution is presence that raises the cost of Chinese interference without requiring a Philippine military response to Chinese force. Blue Ridge is that solution, rendered in steel and a 3-star flag. I spent time going through the public record on how Washington has communicated treaty obligations to Manila over the last 3 years, and one pattern emerges clearly in the official statements. Every escalation in planned Coast Guard activity at Second Thomas Shoal has been followed within weeks by a U.S.-Philippine bilateral engagement that makes the treaty commitment more explicit. The April 2023 water cannon incident produced the Balikatan exercise near Scarborough Shoal. The December 2024 water cannon incident produced the joint patrols in the Philippine Sea. The March 2026 disabled rigid inflatable produced the Blue Ridge deployment. The pattern is a ladder. Each plan action moves the U.S.-Philippine response up one rung. The question the Pentagon is working through is how many rungs are left before the ladder ends, and a qualitatively different response is required. 3 rungs are clearly visible on the current ladder. Rung 1, diplomatic statements and treaty reaffirmations. Rung 2, bilateral exercises, and joint patrols. Rung 3. Flagship deployment during active resupply operations. The latter has at least one more rung. Pre-positioning of U.S. military assets at EDCA sites close enough to Second Thomas Shoal to respond to an incident within hours rather than days. That rung has not been climbed. The EDCA sites on Palawan are agreed, but the equipment and personnel that would make them operationally relevant in a South China Sea response timeline are not fully in place. The basing negotiation is still being conducted. What combination of prepositioned equipment, rotational forces, and U.S. military presence on Palawan serves American deterrence without triggering a Chinese response that breaks the civilian Philippine government's political capacity to sustain the alliance is a calibration that Malacanan Palace and the Pentagon are working through in real time. Here's what this tells us about where the American strategy is actually heading. The United States is not trying to win a military engagement at Second Thomas Shoal. It is trying to make every planned escalation at Second Thomas Shoal incrementally more expensive in the diplomatic, reputational, and strategic calculus, until the cost-benefit analysis shifts enough that Beijing accepts a de facto Philippine presence on BRP Sierra Madre as a stable equilibrium. That is a long game. It requires patience and the willingness to absorb continued planned harassment without escalating to a military response. Blue Ridge is a move in that long game. A command ship, not a combatant. A flag, not a gun. A presence, not a threat. The geometry of that strategy is specific and worth stating clearly. Second Thomas Shoal is 105 nautical miles from Palawan. Scarborough Shoal, which China seized in 2012, is 137 nautical miles from Subic Bay. The distance between those two contested features, Second Thomas Shoal and Scarborough Shoal, is roughly 380 nautical miles. The Philippines sits between them. The southern arc runs from Palawan through the Spratly approaches. The northern arc runs from Luzon through the Luzon Strait. China does not need to physically control the Philippines to isolate it. It needs to control the choke points on either side of the archipelago, the Luzon Strait to the north, through which a significant portion of western Pacific maritime traffic moves, and the Palawan Passage to the west, which connects the South China Sea to the Celebes Sea and the broader maritime routes south. Control those two passages, and you have effectively determined who can resupply, who can reinforce, and who has access to the central Philippine Sea in a contingency. The U.S. position is built on the opposite logic. Keep both passages open, keep Philippine airspace and waters accessible to U.S. forces through the alliance, and ensure that any Chinese attempt to control the approach routes to the Philippines runs into a treaty architecture that raises the cost prohibitively. The EDCA sites are the physical nodes of that architecture. Blue Ridge in Manila Bay is the command node made visible, one number to hold on to. Scarborough Shoal sits 137 nautical miles from Subic Bay and 170 nautical miles from Clark Air Base. F/A-18S, operating from a carrier in the Philippine Sea, can reach Scarborough Shoal in under 40 minutes at operational speed. P-8 Poseidon aircraft operating from Clark, if Clark were an EDCA-activated U.S. access site, would have Scarborough Shoal inside their patrol radius on every sortie. China seized Scarborough Shoal in 2012, before the EDCA expansion, before the post-2022 posture shift, before the current generation of U.S.-Philippines bilateral engagement. The question that the Pentagon is working through is whether a Chinese attempt to apply Scarborough Shoal-style pressure to Second Thomas Shoal in 2026 faces a materially different response architecture than the 2012 seizure did. Blue Ridge in Manila Bay is one data point in that assessment. It is not the answer. It is the signal that Washington is building toward an answer. Will Blue Ridge deploy again during the next contested resupply run? Comment yes or no. That one deployment decision will tell us more about the actual strategy than any official statement. Now the cold assessment. The F-35S on the flight deck, the submarines running sonar sweeps, the Hawkeyes holding their orbits. Read what those assets are actually doing, not what anyone would prefer them to be doing. The structural position favors the United States and the Philippines in the long game for one simple reason. The Philippines has a coastline and the United States has a treaty. China has no treaty that commits a major power to respond to a Philippine-initiated counter-pressure. The plan can deploy Coast Guard vessels. It can build artificial islands. It cannot build an alliance architecture that places a peer military in the theater on the Philippine side of the dispute. That asymmetry holds as long as the same political will holds the helm. It is not wired into the hull permanently. Philippine administrations have ranged from sustained resistance at Second Thomas Shoal to quiet accommodation, and the next election cycle, the next figure walking into Malacanan Palace, the next calculation about Chinese economic pressure against American security guarantees. Those variables are not bolted down the way a sonar dome is bolted to a submarine hull. Beijing is not waiting for the United States to make a mistake at Second Thomas Shoal. It is waiting for the Philippines to make a different political choice. That is the patient strategy. Build artificial islands. Maintain Coast Guard presence. Apply calibrated pressure on every resupply run. Wait for a Philippine government that decides the pressure is not worth sustaining. Blue Ridge's visit does not change that calculation. It raises the cost of one specific plan action during one specific window. It does not change the underlying political dynamics in Manila. It does not change the economic leverage Beijing holds over Philippine trade. It does not change the geographic reality that Second Thomas Shoal is 1,140 miles from Yokosuka and 105 miles from a beach on Palawan. What it changes is the signal. And in the South China Sea, where the contest has been fought primarily in the signal layer for the last decade, that is not nothing. The carrier battle group is the blunt instrument of American power projection. The command ship is the scalpel. USS Blue Ridge in Manila Bay for 8 days during the most contested resupply run of the year was the Pentagon saying, with institutional precision, "We are watching, we are present, we are inside the decision loop, and the Mutual Defense Treaty is not a document in an archive. It is a flag in the harbor." The 7th Fleet flagship sailed home to Yokosuka on the 9th day. The BRP Sierra Madre is still on the reef at Second Thomas Shoal. The Marines are still there. The next resupply run will come. The planned Coast Guard will be waiting at the perimeter. And the question that July 2026 raised but did not answer is whether USS Blue Ridge will be in Manila Bay when that run happens, or whether she will be on the pier in Yokosuka, a capability in port rather than a signal in the water. The board favors the alliance today. The boards in this region change slowly. This one is changing in the direction that gives the United States fewer easy moves and fewer cheap signals. Blue Ridge was the cheap signal. What comes after it is more expensive, and the Pentagon has not yet decided what it is willing to pay. The Palawan basing question remains open. The threshold for treaty invocation remains deliberately ambiguous. The next plan escalation has not yet arrived. Those 3 unresolved variables are not weaknesses in the American position. They are the levers. The question is whether Washington will use them before Beijing decides the calibration it has been running for 3 years is no longer serving its purpose. The flag came down from the harbor. The geography it argued for did not move. If you want to understand the next move on this board, the EDCA activation decision on Palawan, the coming Taiwan Strait pressure cycle, and what the 7th Fleet does when the cheap signals run out. Subscribe. The analysis continues.